There is a unique, suffocating kind of heartbreak that only a mother can understand when she realizes the child she raised is actively plotting her ruin. For 68 years, I believed that family was the ultimate sanctuary, a sacred bond forged in unconditional love and mutual protection. I had spent my entire life building an empire from the ground up, sacrificing my own comforts to ensure my son, David, would never know a day of struggle. But as I sat in the pristine kitchen of my estate, listening to the very boy I brought into this world coldly calculate how to lock me away in a facility to steal my life's work, the tragedy of my existence felt absolute. It felt like a physical blow to the chest. Yet they made one fatal miscalculation in their greedy little scheme. They assumed my silence meant ignorance, and they assumed my age meant weakness. They were about to learn that a mother's wrath is as meticulous as her love, and by trying to bury me, they were merely digging their own graves. My name is Barbara Sterling. Alongside my late husband, Arthur, I spent 4 decades turning a modest savings account into a sprawling $4 million real estate portfolio. When Arthur passed away 5 years ago, the silence in our massive, 6-bedroom colonial estate was nearly deafening. But I adapted. I kept the gardens perfectly manicured, managed the commercial leases with a sharp eye, and hosted Sunday dinners in the formal dining room, clinging to the comforting illusion of family. My son, David, and his wife, Jessica, were always the first to arrive at those dinners, pouring expensive wine and offering wide, gleaming smiles. I thought they were checking in on me out of love. I thought their frequent visits and sudden, hovering concern were the hallmarks of a devoted son worrying about his aging mother living all alone. The shatterpoint of my reality occurred on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the marble countertops after preparing a light lunch, while David and Jessica waited in the living room. I had momentarily stepped away to put the kettle on for tea. My smartphone, resting on the counter next to the sink, suddenly buzzed with a motion detection alert from the security camera app. I had installed discrete cameras near the front door and in the main entryways a few months prior, at David's own insistence, for security purposes. Thinking it was a delivery driver dropping off a package on the porch, I tapped the notification. But the camera hadn't picked up the front door. It had picked up the feed from the living room camera, which possessed a highly sensitive microphone. Through the tiny speaker of my phone, the audio came through crisp and chillingly clear. "We can't just keep waiting, David," Jessica's voice hissed, laced with a venomous impatience I had never heard her use. "The balloon payments on your commercial loans are due in 90 days. If we don't get the capital to cover your business debts, we are going to lose everything." "I know, Jess, I know," David replied. His voice, the voice of my only child, sounded incredibly calm, devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "That's why we need to accelerate the timeline. We just have to establish a documented pattern of cognitive decline. It won't take much. We keep moving her things around, gaslighting her about conversations we never had. We make her doubt her own memory." I stood frozen, the dishcloth slipping from my trembling fingers and falling silently onto the floor. "And once she's confused enough," Jessica pressed. "We file for emergency conservatorship," David stated, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. "We get a doctor to declare her mentally incompetent, move her into that state-run assisted living facility on the east side, and take control of the estate. Once I have the durable power of attorney, we liquidate the vacation homes and the commercial properties. She has $4 million tied up in assets, Jess. She won't need it where she's going. The facility only costs a fraction of that, and the rest covers my company." The kettle began to shriek, a high, piercing whistle that perfectly matched the silent scream tearing through my throat. I stared at the phone, my entire world collapsing into a pile of ash. My son, my own flesh and blood. He wasn't waiting for me to die. He was actively planning to erase me while I was still breathing, trading my freedom and dignity to cover his own financial failures. The urge to storm into the living room, scream, and throw them out of my house was overwhelming. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, a toxic cocktail of profound heartbreak and pure adrenaline. But as I reached for the kettle, turning off the burner, the hot tears in my eyes suddenly went ice cold. I smoothed down my blouse, picked up the dishcloth, and took a slow, deep breath. I would not give them the hysterical, confused old woman they needed. I poured the tea, arranged the delicate porcelain cups on a silver tray, and walked into the living room with a pleasant, unassuming smile. The war had officially begun, and I was going to ensure their absolute destruction. Walking from the kitchen to the living room took exactly 15 steps. For 4 decades, I had walked those polished hardwood floors as a wife, a mother, and the proud matriarch of the Sterling family. But that afternoon, carrying a silver tray laden with Earl Grey tea and lemon biscuits, every single step felt like wading through wet cement. The audio recording I had just intercepted on my phone was still echoing in my ears, a vile, venomous loop of my son and his wife plotting to erase my autonomy, steal my life's work, and lock me away in a state-run facility. I paused just behind the arched doorway, taking one final, grounding breath. I forced the muscles in my face to relax, smoothing the shock from my brow, and painted on a warm, oblivious smile. "Sorry for the delay, darlings," I chimed, stepping into the sunlight-flooded living room. The kettle was being absolutely stubborn today. David was sitting on the plush leather sofa, casually scrolling through his phone. He looked up, offering me that same boyish, charming smile that had once convinced me he could do no wrong. Jessica was perched beside him, her legs elegantly crossed, adjusting the cuffs of her expensive designer blouse, a blouse I noted with a sudden spike of bile that I had purchased for her birthday just a month prior. "No worries, Mom," David said, standing up to take the heavy silver tray from my hands. "You know you don't have to wait on us hand and foot. You should be resting." "Oh, nonsense," I waved a dismissive hand, taking a seat in my favorite velvet armchair. "I like keeping busy. It keeps the mind sharp." I watched them closely as I said it. It was a microscopic reaction, but I caught it, the brief, knowing, almost pitying glance that passed between my son and his wife. The silent confirmation of the sinister game they were about to play. Over the next 4 weeks, my home transformed into a psychological battlefield. David and Jessica's campaign of manufactured madness began subtly, deploying tactics designed to make me doubt the fundamental reliability of my own brain. It was a grotesque, exhausting dance of deception. It started with the small things. I have always been a creature of rigid habit. For 20 years, the moment I walked through the front door, I hung my car keys on the brass hook beside the entryway mirror. One Tuesday morning, after David had stopped by for a quick welfare check the evening before, I went to grab my keys to run to the grocery store. The brass hook was empty. I searched the entryway. I checked my purse. I spent 20 minutes looking for them, a genuine flicker of panic rising in my chest. I finally found them buried at the bottom of the laundry basket in the utility room. When David came over for dinner that night, I casually mentioned the bizarre incident, pretending to be utterly bewildered. "That's so strange, David," I murmured, staring into my teacup. "I found my keys in the laundry room. I have absolutely no memory of putting them there." David reached across the table, placing his large, warm hand over mine. His face was the absolute picture of gentle, filial concern, but looking into his eyes, I saw the cold, dead calculation of a predator. "Mom, you were probably just doing a load of wash when you came inside and set them down without thinking," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It happens to everyone. But you have been a little forgetful lately. Remember last week when you couldn't find your reading glasses? We found them in the refrigerator." My chest tightened. Because Jessica put them there while I was in the bathroom, I thought, the ice in my veins thickening. But outwardly, I let my hand tremble slightly beneath his. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of fragile vulnerability. I suppose you're right," I whispered, looking away. "I just don't know where my head is lately." "It's okay, Barbara," Jessica cooed from across the table, her tone sickeningly sweet. "We're here for you. We'll always look out for you." The gaslighting escalated rapidly. They began intentionally sabotaging the technology in my home. One afternoon, I sat down at my desk in the study to review the monthly ledgers for my commercial properties. I tried to log into my primary banking portal, but my password was rejected. I tried again. Blocked. I checked the Wi-Fi router. The cables had been deliberately swapped, killing the internet connection to my desktop. I called David, playing the part of the flustered, confused elderly woman perfectly. He arrived an hour later, sighed heavily, and spent 10 minutes fixing the issue. "Mom, you went into the settings and completely scrambled the router," David explained, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. "And you locked yourself out of your banking app. You must have tried the wrong password too many times." "I could have sworn I typed it correctly," I fretted, wringing my hands together. David stood up, running a hand through his hair in an elaborate display of exhaustion. "Look, Mom, the commercial properties, the massive estate accounts, it's a lot of pressure. It's too much for you to manage alone anymore. It's getting dangerous. What if you accidentally wire money to the wrong place? Let me take over the primary checking account, just as a precaution. I'll handle the day-to-day bills so you don't have to stress about it." It was the opening salvo of their financial siege. He wanted access. He wanted to establish a foothold in my accounts to prove to a judge that I was already surrendering my financial autonomy. I looked at him, feeling a profound, agonizing grief wash over me. I remembered rocking him to sleep when he had a fever. I remembered working 80-hour weeks with his father to pay for his elite private university tuition. I remembered the boy who used to look at me like I hung the moon. That boy was entirely dead, replaced by a parasite trying to drain the host dry. I swallowed the grief, burying it deep in the dark, cold earth of my new reality. "You're such a good boy, David," I said, offering him a wavering, grateful smile. "Yes, maybe that would be best, just the checking account for now, until I can get my head straight." "Of course, Mom," he smiled, a dark, triumphant glint flashing in his eyes. The climax of their psychological warfare occurred at the end of the month. They staged a formal intervention. They invited themselves over for Sunday dinner, bringing a store-bought casserole and wearing matching expressions of grave, theatrical sorrow. We sat in the formal dining room, the heavy mahogany table feeling like a tribunal bench. "Barbara," Jessica began, reaching out to grasp my hand. Her skin felt cold and clammy, like a reptile. "We need to have a very serious conversation. We love you so much, but we are deeply, deeply worried about you." "Worried?" I asked, letting my voice quaver perfectly. "Whatever do you mean, dear?" David leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. "Mom, your cognitive decline over the last few weeks has been rapid. You're losing things, you're confused by your own computer. Yesterday, you called me and asked what time Dad was coming home from work. Mom, Dad has been dead for 5 years. I hadn't done that. I hadn't made that phone call. The sheer audacity of the lie, the profound cruelty required to use my dead husband's memory as a weapon to convince me I was losing my mind, was breathtaking. It took every ounce of my willpower not to reach across the table and slap the face of the man sitting opposite me. Instead, I let a single, perfect tear spill over my cheek. I pulled my hand away from Jessica's grasp and covered my face, letting my shoulders heave as if I were utterly broken by the revelation. "I don't know what's happening to me," I sobbed into my hands, delivering the exact performance they required to fuel their arrogance. "I'm so scared, David. I'm so scared of losing my mind." "SHH, Mom, it's okay," David said smoothly, walking around the table to wrap an arm around my shaking shoulders. "We're going to get you some help. We're going to look into some beautiful, safe facilities where you can have round-the-clock care. We'll handle everything. You don't have to worry about the house, or the money, or the business anymore. I'm going to take care of it all." They stayed for another hour, consoling the pathetic, terrified old woman they thought they had successfully created. They left the house practically buzzing with victory, entirely convinced that their trap had snapped shut and that I was completely at their mercy. I listened to the heavy thud of the front door closing. I waited until I heard the engine of David's luxury SUV start in the driveway and fade off down the street. The absolute second the house was silent, the trembling in my hands ceased entirely. My spine straightened. The fragile, confused posture evaporated, replaced by a posture of absolute, unshakable steel. I wiped the single tear from my cheek, walked over to the antique mahogany bar cart in the corner of the room, and poured myself a neat glass of 20-year-old scotch. I took a slow, deliberate sip, feeling the amber liquid burn a path down my throat, warming the ice in my chest. They wanted a senile, helpless victim. They thought they had successfully manufactured a narrative of madness that no judge could ignore. But they had tragically underestimated the intellect of the woman who had built the very empire they were trying to steal. I set the crystal glass down on the table, my eyes locking onto the blank screen of my smartphone. It was time to stop playing defense. I pulled up my contacts, bypassing my family entirely, and clicked on the number of the most aggressive, ruthless neurologist in the state. The madness they had manufactured was about to meet the masterpiece of my revenge. The morning after my son and daughter-in-law held their pathetic theatrical intervention, I woke up before the sun even crested the horizon. The house was entirely silent, bathed in the cool, gray light of pre-dawn. I lay in my king-sized bed for a long moment, staring up at the ornate crown molding of the ceiling. A younger, softer version of myself might have spent this quiet hour weeping over the sheer, unnatural cruelty of a child turning against his mother. But the tears had all been shed the day I intercepted their conversation on the security camera. The woman lying in the bed today was not a grieving mother. I was an architect preparing for war. If David and Jessica wanted to play a game of legal and medical chess, I was going to ensure they never even saw the board until it was too late to move their pieces. I knew that the foundation of their entire parasitic scheme rested on one critical pillar. They needed a doctor to declare me mentally unfit. Without a medical consensus of severe cognitive decline, a judge would never grant an emergency conservatorship. Therefore, my first objective was to build a medical shield so thick, so brilliantly verified, that it would shatter any fabricated claims my son attempted to present in county court. I rose from bed, showered, and dressed with meticulous care. I chose a tailored, charcoal gray Chanel suit, a simple strand of pearls, and a pair of sensible but expensive low heels. I needed to project absolute, unshakable authority. Before I left the master suite, I took my smartphone, the very device that had exposed their plot, and plugged it into the charger on my nightstand. I knew that David, in his arrogant attempt to monitor his ailing mother, had likely installed a GPS tracking feature on my phone under the guise of an emergency locator app. If he saw my digital dot traveling out of the county, he would panic and intercept me. Leaving it behind meant I was entirely untethered from his surveillance. I walked down the sweeping mahogany staircase and slipped out the back door, using a prepaid burner phone I had purchased with cash at a local pharmacy the day prior to call a private black car service. My late husband, Arthur, and I used to use them for trips to the airport. The driver, a quiet, discreet man named Thomas, pulled up to the rear service gate of the estate exactly 10 minutes later. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling," Thomas greeted, opening the heavy door of the town car. "Where are we heading today?" "To the Hammond Clinic in Westbridge, Thomas," I replied, sliding into the leather backseat. "And there is no need to rush. I have the entire morning." Westbridge was a wealthy, sprawling municipality located 2 towns over, entirely outside of David's social and professional sphere. I had deliberately chosen not to visit my primary care physician, Dr. Evans, because he was a golfing buddy of David's. I couldn't risk the conflict of interest, nor could I risk David intercepting my medical records through casual conversation. Instead, I had booked an appointment with Dr. Elias Kensington, one of the most prestigious, ruthless, and highly decorated neurologists in the state. The drive took 45 minutes. As I watched the autumn trees blur past the tinted windows of the town car, my mind was perfectly clear, calculating timelines and asset liquidations with the precision of a Swiss watch. The Hammond Clinic was a sleek, sterile masterpiece of modern architecture, all frosted glass and brushed steel. I walked into the reception area, bypassed the standard intake forms, and paid for my entire battery of tests up front using a certified cashier's check drawn from an obscure secondary bank account David knew absolutely nothing about. No insurance claims. No paper trail sent to my home address. Dr. Kensington was a tall, sharply dressed man in his late 50s with piercing blue eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He ushered me into his private examination room, reviewing my intake file with a slight frown. "Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Kensington began, sitting across from me. "Your file indicates you are requesting a comprehensive cognitive evaluation, including memory stress tests and an MRI, but you list no symptoms. No instances of memory loss, no disorientation, no history of early-onset Alzheimer's in your family. To be perfectly frank, you present as incredibly sharp. Why are you here?" I looked at him, admiring his directness. I decided to give him the absolute, unvarnished truth. "Dr. Kensington, I am a very wealthy widow," I said, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I have an estate valued at over $4 million. Recently, I discovered that my son and his wife are actively conspiring to manufacture a narrative of severe cognitive decline in order to seize my assets via an emergency conservatorship. They intend to lock me in a facility and liquidate my life's work to cover his failing business debts. Dr. Kensington's pen stopped hovering over his notepad. His blue eyes widened slightly, the clinical detachment vanishing, replaced by a profound professional disgust. In his line of work, he had likely seen the ugly side of elder abuse, but rarely did the victim walk into his office fully aware and prepared to fight back. "I need proof," I continued, my voice as hard and cold as a diamond. "I need you to run every single test you possess. I want the MRI, the CT scan, the spatial awareness exams, the psychological evaluations. I want you to push my brain to its absolute limit, Dr. Kensington. And when I pass, I want the results certified, stamped, and notarized. I need an ironclad medical shield that no corrupt county judge can possibly ignore." A slow, deeply respectful smile spread across the neurologist's face. He set his pen down and nodded. "Mrs. Sterling, it would be my absolute pleasure. Let's get to work." The next 4 hours were grueling. I was subjected to an intense, exhausting battery of cognitive and neurological exams. I was asked to count backward from 100 by sevens while solving complex logic puzzles. I memorized lists of 30 unrelated words and was asked to recall them in reverse order an hour later. I drew intricate geometric shapes from memory, identified obscure historical events, and lay perfectly still in the deafening, magnetic tube of an MRI machine while they mapped the physical architecture of my brain. Through it all, I didn't falter. Every time the exhaustion threatened to creep in, I simply thought of Jessica's sickeningly sweet voice from the night before, treating me like a senile child in my own dining room, and my focus sharpened into a lethal point. When the testing finally concluded, I sat back in Dr. Kensington's office, sipping a glass of water while he reviewed the massive stack of raw data and the digital brain scans glowing on his monitors. He turned in his chair to face me, shaking his head in sheer, unadulterated marvel. "Mrs. Sterling," he breathed, tapping his finger against the edge of his desk. "Your cerebral cortex shows absolutely zero signs of atrophy. Your neural pathways are immaculate. In fact, your cognitive function, memory retention, and problem-solving metrics aren't just normal for a woman of 68. They are functioning in the 99th percentile. You have the mental acuity and processing speed of a highly educated woman 30 years your junior." "So I am not losing my mind?" I asked dryly. "You are arguably the sharpest person I will speak to all month," he laughed, signing his name with a heavy flourish across the bottom of a thick official document. He stamped it with his medical seal, slid it into a heavy manila envelope, and handed it across the desk to me. "Here is your certified evaluation. If your son's lawyers attempt to present you as incompetent, this document will make them look like absolute fools." "Thank you, doctor." "You have been invaluable," I said, slipping the envelope into my designer handbag. I left the clinic, sliding back into the warm leather of Thomas's waiting town car. The medical shield was officially forged. Now I needed a sword. "Downtown, please, Thomas," I instructed. "The law offices of Vance and Associates." Richard Vance was not a family lawyer. He didn't handle polite mediations or friendly estate planning. He was a corporate shark, a man my late husband had hired a decade ago to facilitate a particularly ruthless, hostile corporate takeover. He was brilliant, entirely devoid of sentimentality, and practically feared by the local judiciary. If I was going to dismantle my son's life, I needed a man who understood how to orchestrate a financial bloodbath. I arrived at his sprawling, glass-paneled corner office on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper just after 2 in the afternoon. Mr. Vance, a silver-haired man in a bespoke navy suit, greeted me with a look of mild surprise. "Barbara Sterling," he smiled, shaking my hand warmly. "It has been years since Arthur passed. I didn't expect to see you in my lobby. To what do I owe the pleasure?" I sat down in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his massive desk. I didn't engage in small talk. I simply reached into my handbag, pulled out the certified neurological evaluation, and dropped it onto the center of his desk with a heavy thud. "Richard, I am here to hire you," I said, leaning forward. "My son is currently orchestrating a plot to have me declared legally incompetent." He intends to file for an emergency conservatorship to steal my estate and liquidate my assets behind my back. Vance's friendly demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus that made him so notoriously successful. He picked up the medical file, scanning the certified results. "And I assume, based on Dr. Kensington's incredibly glowing review of your mental faculties, that you are perfectly aware of this plot and intend to stop him?" Vance asked, looking up over the rim of his glasses. "I don't just want to stop him, Richard," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "I want to absolutely decimate him. I want to restructure my entire $4 million empire so deeply and so secretly that, when he inevitably walks into a courtroom and tries to take everything I own, he discovers that there is absolutely nothing left for him to take. I want to build a financial phantom." Vance sat back in his chair, a slow, dark, magnificent smile spreading across his face. "Barbara," the lawyer murmured, lacing his fingers together in a gesture of pure, unadulterated anticipation, "I think you and I are going to have a very productive afternoon." To make $4 million completely vanish into thin air without raising a single red flag requires a very specific type of legal dark magic. Fortunately for me, Richard Vance was the undisputed grandmaster of the craft. Sitting in his sprawling, glass-paneled corner office overlooking the city, I watched as Richard paced in front of his floor-to-ceiling windows. The certified neurological evaluation, proving my absolute mental competence, rested on his pristine mahogany desk like a loaded gun, ready to be fired when the time was right. But right now, we were focused on the stealth operation. If David believed I was rapidly losing my mind, I needed to ensure that by the time he tried to take control of my life, the empire he was hoping to inherit had already ceased to exist. "The fundamental vulnerability of your current portfolio, Barbara, is its visibility," Richard explained, tapping a gold pen against his chin. "Your commercial properties, the vacation homes, your brokerage accounts, they are all directly tied to your social security number or your primary living trust, which David knows about. If he secures a conservatorship, even a temporary one, a judge will grant him immediate access to the deeds and the ledgers. We need to sever those ties completely. We need to build a financial phantom." "Then let's start dismantling," I said, my voice steady. "I want the real estate liquidated, all of it except for the primary estate where I currently reside, as selling my own home would alert him too quickly." Over the next 3 weeks, I lived a bizarre, exhausting double life. By night, I was the frail, rapidly declining mother my son and his greedy wife so desperately wanted me to be. When David and Jessica came over for their weekly dinners, I delivered Oscar-worthy performances of manufactured dementia. I would accidentally call Jessica by David's first wife's name, much to her visible annoyance. I would put the milk in the pantry and leave the television remote in the refrigerator. I would stare blankly at the wall mid-conversation, pretending to lose my train of thought entirely. David would sigh heavily, exchanging triumphant, patronizing glances with his wife, entirely convinced that my brain was actively turning to mush. By day, however, my brain was executing multi-million-dollar transactions with the lethal precision of a corporate raider. Working quietly through Richard Vance's network of discreet brokers, we began selling off the lucrative assets I had spent 4 decades acquiring. First to go was the beautiful, sprawling lake house in Geneva, a property David had often bragged to his friends would one day be his private summer retreat. We sold it off-market to a private buyer for just under $1 million in cash. Next was the commercial strip mall on the wealthy side of town, a property that generated substantial monthly rental income. To hide the sale, Richard set up a blind LLC in Delaware, transferred the deed of the commercial property into the LLC, and then sold the corporate entity itself. On paper, to any local clerk or nosy son checking the county property records, nothing had changed. But the asset was gone, converted into completely untraceable liquid capital. Within a month, over $3.5 million had been silently excavated from my visible portfolio. "Now," Richard said, sitting across from me during our 4th clandestine meeting, looking at the staggering balance of the newly acquired liquid funds on his encrypted laptop. "We must protect the capital. We are going to establish a highly fortified, irrevocable trust. Unlike a standard revocable trust, which a conservator might attempt to breach or alter, an irrevocable trust permanently removes the assets from your personal taxable estate. You surrender direct ownership to the trust, meaning even if a judge declares you incompetent tomorrow, you legally do not own this money. Therefore, David cannot touch it. Perfect, I replied, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. Set it up. We need to designate the beneficiaries, Richard noted, poising his hands over his keyboard. Who receives the funds when the trust matures or upon your passing? I didn't even have to think about it. My granddaughter, Chloe. Chloe was David's daughter from his first marriage. When David had divorced Chloe's mother to run off with Jessica, a younger, infinitely more materialistic woman, he had effectively abandoned his child. He fought tooth and nail to avoid paying child support, claiming his business was reinvesting capital, and he rarely remembered the poor girl's birthday. Despite her father's cruel neglect, Chloe had grown into a brilliant, compassionate 20-year-old nursing student who worked double shifts to pay for her textbooks. She visited me in secret, bringing me wildflowers and spending hours drinking tea with me, genuinely loving her grandmother without a single ulterior motive. Divide the trust, I instructed Richard, a cold, vindictive smile touching my lips. 80% goes to Chloe. The stipulations should state that her father, David Sterling, is legally barred from acting as a trustee, financial proxy, or manager of her inheritance under any circumstances. If he tries to touch a dime of her money, the trust will automatically cover her legal fees to destroy him in civil court. Ruthless Barbara. I love it, Richard chuckled, typing rapidly, and the remaining 20%. The local Golden Years Animal Rescue, I said. David has always hated dogs. He thinks they are dirty and a waste of money. I want him to sit in a lawyer's office one day and realize that a shelter full of stray golden retrievers inherited nearly $1 million while he got absolutely nothing. Richard laughed aloud, a sharp, barking sound of genuine amusement. Consider it done. The funds will be transferred by tomorrow morning. Your $4 million is now locked in an impenetrable legal vault. We have one final piece of business, I said, pulling my designer handbag onto my lap. The decoy. If David went to a judge to claim emergency conservatorship, he would need to present a financial crisis to justify rushing the legal process. I had already agreed to let him monitor my primary checking account, the account where my monthly living expenses were managed, and historically, where a comfortable buffer of $50,000 had always sat. It was the only account David could still see, and I needed to set the bait. I want you to drain the primary checking account, I told Richard, sliding my bank routing details across the desk. Leave exactly $4,000 in it, no more, no less. Richard raised an eyebrow. $4,000. Barbara, that's barely enough to cover your estate's property taxes for a month. If he sees that balance, he's going to panic. He'll think you are hemorrhaging money. Exactly, I replied, my eyes narrowing. I want him to panic. If he thinks the gold mine is evaporating because of my dementia, his greed will override his caution. He'll rush the conservatorship filing, which means he'll make mistakes. To complete the illusion, I spent the next 3 days creating a chaotic, terrifying paper trail on that specific checking account. I went to the bank and withdrew $10,000 in cash, which I promptly locked in a private safe deposit box that David didn't know existed. I wrote 2 bizarre, disjointed checks for $5,000 each to entirely fictional charities, intentionally misspelling the names and making my signature look shaky and uncoordinated. I made it look like an old, confused woman was actively squandering her life savings to scammers and thin air. When David inevitably checked the online portal to monitor my finances, he wouldn't see the brilliant, multi-million-dollar restructuring I had achieved with Richard Vance. He would only see a checking account that had plummeted from $50,000 down to $4,000 in a matter of days. He would see chaotic withdrawals. He would see madness. The financial phantom was fully operational. The trap was meticulously laid, covered in the deceptive leaves of my supposed senility. All I had to do now was wait for my greedy, treacherous son to step into the snare. I didn't have to wait long because what I discovered during his next welfare check proved that David was far more desperate and far more criminal than even I had anticipated. It took exactly 4 days for the trap to spring. I knew David's routine intimately. He was a creature of intense, paranoid habit, especially when it came to money. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, he logged into his business accounts and subsequently into my primary checking account to monitor my spending. On Friday at 9:15 a.m., I was sitting in my sunroom, sipping a cup of Earl Grey and watching a pair of blue jays bicker over the bird feeder when my phone rang. It was David. The caller ID flashed his smiling face, a photo taken at a charity gala 3 years ago. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, steadying breath, allowing my posture to slump slightly before I answered. If you are going to play a role, you must inhabit it entirely. Hello, I answered, letting my voice sound thin, slightly breathless, and perfectly bewildered. Mom, it's David, he said. His voice was tight, strained with an underlying panic that he was desperately trying to mask with authoritative concern. Mom, I'm looking at the online banking portal, the primary checking account. There's only $4,000 in it. Where did the rest of the money go? I let out a soft, confused flutter of a gasp. 4,000. No, David, that can't be right. There should be over 50,000 in there. I checked it just last month. Mom, it's gone, he pressed, the panic bleeding through the edges of his calm facade. There are massive cash withdrawals, $10,000 here. 2 checks for $5,000 there, written out to charities I've never even heard of. What did you do? Did someone call you? Did you give your account numbers to someone over the phone? I don't know, I stammered, raising a hand to my forehead as if fighting off a sudden migraine. I squeezed my eyes shut, channeling the phantom terror of a woman losing her grip on reality. I don't remember writing any checks, David. I don't remember going to the bank. Oh God, am I being robbed? Did someone steal my checkbook? David, I'm so scared. Stay right there, he ordered, his tone suddenly shifting from panic to a dark, authoritative command. Don't touch anything. Don't answer the phone if anyone calls. I'm coming over right now to figure this out. He hung up. I lowered the phone from my ear, the frail, trembling expression washing off my face like cheap watercolor paint. I took another sip of my tea. The bait had been swallowed whole. David arrived 20 minutes later, his tires screeching slightly as he pulled his luxury SUV into the circular driveway. I watched from the window as he hurried up the front steps, clutching a thick, distressed leather briefcase. It was a briefcase I had bought for him in Italy to celebrate his promotion a decade ago. Seeing it in his hand, a tool of his treachery, filled me with a cold, quiet disgust. When I opened the door, I immediately collapsed into his arms, weeping dry tears into the lapel of his expensive suit. David, I don't know what's happening to me, I sobbed, clutching at his jacket. The money, I can't find my ledger. My mind is just a fog. Please, you have to help me. It's okay, Mom. SHH, it's going to be okay, he murmured, patting my back with stiff, awkward hands. He led me into the kitchen, setting his heavy leather briefcase down on the granite island. Sit down. I'm going to sort this out. We are going to protect your assets. But you have to trust me, okay? You have to let me take the wheel. I trust you, David, I whispered, staring blindly at my hands. You're all I have. He nodded, a look of grim satisfaction crossing his features. Okay. I'm going to make some calls to the bank fraud department. But first, the garage door opener was acting up when I pulled in. The sensor is blinking red. I'm going to go check the alignment so the door doesn't get stuck open and leave the house vulnerable. Stay right here. Thank you, dear, I murmured. He turned and walked down the back hallway, opening the heavy fire door that led out into the sprawling 4-car garage. I heard the door click shut. I heard his heavy footsteps echoing on the concrete. The absolute second the garage door closed, the weeping, helpless mother vanished. I stood up from the kitchen stool, moving with the silent, lethal speed of a striking viper. I walked over to the granite island and stared down at the Italian leather briefcase. He hadn't locked the brass clasps. In his rush to play the hero and secure the perimeter, he had left his secrets entirely exposed in the heart of my home. My heart hammered against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thud in my ears. I knew I only had a matter of minutes. If he walked back in and caught me rifling through his legal documents, the illusion of my senility would instantly shatter, and he would realize he was being hunted. But the opportunity was simply too golden to ignore. I flipped the brass clasps. They popped open with a soft, metallic click. I lifted the leather flap. Inside, the briefcase was meticulously organized, a testament to David's obsessive nature. There were a few glossy brochures sitting right on top. I pulled them out, my stomach turning as I read the elegant, cursive font. Sunny Pines Assisted Living, the Meadows Memory Care Facility. They were pamphlets for highly restrictive, state-funded nursing homes, the kind of places where elderly wards of the state were parked in wheelchairs facing televisions until they quietly expired. He was already shopping for my prison. I shoved the pamphlets back into the leather pocket and dug deeper. Beneath his tablet and a stack of business ledgers, there was a thick, unmarked manila envelope. I pulled it out, untwisted the red string closure, and slid the documents into the bright, morning light of the kitchen. It was a legal packet, printed on heavy bond paper. The bold heading at the top of the first page practically leaped off the paper: Durable Power of Attorney and Declaration of CONSERVATORSHIP. My eyes darted across the legalese. The document was a masterclass in total financial surrender. It appointed David Arthur Sterling as the sole, uncontested agent over my person and my estate. It granted him the unilateral, absolute power to sell real estate, liquidate bank accounts, alter trusts, make medical decisions, and legally bind me to residential care facilities without my consent. It was essentially a legal death warrant. Once this was filed with a judge, Barbara Sterling would cease to exist as an autonomous human being. I would be legally reduced to a piece of property managed by my son. But it was the final page that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. I flipped to the signature page. There, sitting neatly on the dotted line above my printed name, was my signature: Barbara Ann Sterling. I stared at it, a profound, chilling silence rushing into the kitchen. It was my signature. The sharp, sweeping B, the precise loop of the S, the slight, elegant slant I had perfected over 40 years of signing commercial leases and bank drafts. It was flawless. But I had never signed this document. David hadn't just prepared the paperwork. He and Jessica had actively, painstakingly practiced my handwriting until they could replicate it with terrifying accuracy. They had committed a blatant, undeniable felony. They were not waiting for a judge to simply agree with their assessment of my mental decline. They were actively manufacturing the legal consent to steal $4 million. I didn't panic. I didn't gasp. A strange, total calm washed over my mind, the kind of absolute clarity that only arrives in the eye of a hurricane. I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the camera app, ensuring the flash was turned off and the resolution was set to the highest possible metric. Holding my breath to steady my hands, I took a photograph of the first page. I flipped the heavy bond paper and took a photograph of the second. Finally, I framed the signature page, making sure the forged signature and the date were perfectly, undeniably in focus, and pressed the shutter button. Click. The digital capture of my son's federal crime was safely secured in my camera roll. Suddenly, I heard the heavy, metallic grind of the garage door tracks echoing through the walls. David was finishing up. He would be walking through the fire door in less than 30 seconds. Moving with practiced, terrified speed, I slid the forged documents back into the manila envelope. I wrapped the red string closure exactly as I had found it, tucked the envelope beneath his business ledgers, and shoved the nursing home pamphlets back on top. I lowered the heavy leather flap of the briefcase and pressed the brass clasps down. They snapped shut with a soft, definitive snick. I walked backward, returning to the kitchen island stool. I picked up a stray napkin and pressed it to my eyes, letting my shoulders slump forward, forcing my breathing into shallow, ragged gasps. 10 seconds later, the heavy door from the garage swung open. David walked in, wiping a streak of black grease off his hands with a paper towel. He looked at me, sitting hunched over the kitchen island, and offered a reassuring, deeply patronizing smile. "All fixed, Mom," he said, tossing the dirty paper towel into the trash can. "Just a loose wire on the sensor. So, I was thinking about the bank. I'm going to take this afternoon to go down to the branch and figure out exactly what happened to your money, but I really think, given this incident, it might be time for us to talk about getting you some professional, full-time help, maybe even moving you somewhere safer." I looked up at him, my eyes shining with manufactured tears, playing the broken, terrified victim to absolute perfection. "Whatever you think is best, David," I whispered, my voice trembling like a frail autumn leaf. "I don't know what I would do without you." "I know, Mom," he said, walking over to pick up his leather briefcase. He patted the top of it affectionately, entirely unaware that it had just become the coffin for his future. "I know." He kissed the top of my head and walked out the front door, hurrying off to execute his master plan. I listened to his SUV pull away, the sound fading into the crisp morning air. I sat alone in the kitchen, the silence returning to the estate. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my encrypted email application, and attached the 3 high-resolution photographs of the forged documents. I typed in Richard Vance's secure email address. In the subject line, I typed 3 words, "Spring the trap." I hit send. As the progress bar zipped across the top of the screen, confirming the transmission of the felony evidence to the most ruthless attorney in the state, a slow, magnificent smile spread across my face. David thought he was laying the groundwork to steal an empire. He had no idea he had just handed me the match to burn his entire life to the ground. The digital progress bar on my phone screen zipped to 100%, finalizing the transmission with a soft, cheerful chime. I set the device face down on the granite countertop and exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry the last remnants of my maternal grief with it. The evidence of my son's felony forgery was now resting securely in the encrypted inbox of Richard Vance. Less than 5 minutes later, my burner phone, the cheap, plastic prepaid device I kept hidden at the bottom of a flour canister in the pantry, began to vibrate. I dug it out and pressed it to my ear. "Barbara," Richard's voice crackled through the cheap speaker, thick with a dark, predatory amusement. "I must say, when you told me you were going to build a snare, I didn't realize you were going to hand me the bear trap preloaded. I am looking at the photographs now. It's an incredibly brazen forgery, visually convincing to a layman or a rushed county clerk, but a professional handwriting analyst will tear it to shreds in 30 seconds. The pen pressure is entirely wrong. It's enough for him to file the emergency petition." I asked, pacing the length of the kitchen. "More than enough," Richard confirmed. "With this forged durable power of attorney, paired with an affidavit swearing that you are an immediate danger to yourself and your finances, a judge will likely grant a temporary, ex parte conservatorship without you even needing to be present for the initial order. He is handing us his own head on a silver platter. We just have to let him walk into the courthouse." "He went to the bank this afternoon," I noted, looking out the window at the empty driveway, "to investigate the $4,000 balance I left in the primary checking account. He is going to be desperate." "Good, desperation breeds haste," Richard said smoothly. "Let him panic. Give him the final push. Make him believe that if he doesn't file those papers by Monday morning, there won't be an estate left to steal." I ended the call, buried the phone back in the flour canister, and prepared for my final performance. When David returned to the house later that evening, he looked as though he had aged 5 years in a single afternoon. His tie was loosened, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, suffocating greed. Because he was only an authorized viewer on my primary checking account, the bank manager had legally refused to confirm or deny the existence of any other accounts, let alone the impenetrable irrevocable trust Richard and I had established. To David's panicked mind, the chaotic withdrawals and the abysmal $4,000 balance were absolute proof that my mind was rapidly disintegrating, and that I was actively hemorrhaging his inheritance to scammers and thin air. "Mom," he had gasped, pacing the living room while I sat trembling in my armchair. "The bank wouldn't tell me everything, but it's worse than I thought. You are bleeding cash. We have to get your assets secured. I'm bringing Jessica over for Sunday dinner this weekend. We are going to sit down, and we are going to figure out a plan for your care." "Whatever you say, David," I had whispered, playing the fragile, broken bird to absolute perfection. By the time Sunday evening arrived, the stage was meticulously set. I spent the afternoon roasting a chicken, filling the house with the rich, comforting aromas of garlic, rosemary, and domestic tranquility. I set the formal dining table with the good crystal and the heavy silver flatware, but I also made deliberate, calculated mistakes. I placed a salad fork inside one of the water goblets. I set a folded napkin directly on top of a lit, flameless candle. I left the refrigerator door wide open. When David and Jessica arrived, the tension rolling off them was palpable. They carried the heavy, breathless energy of executioners walking to the gallows. They took their seats at the dining table, exchanging a long, significant look when Jessica noticed the fork inside her water glass. "Barbara, honey," Jessica cooed, reaching over to extract the silverware with a patronizing little sigh. "Are you feeling all right tonight? You seem a little scattered." "Oh, I'm fine, dear," I murmured, serving the roasted vegetables with a slightly trembling hand. "Just a bit tired. The days seem to blur together lately." David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He had brought his Italian leather briefcase into the dining room, setting it on the floor right beside his chair. The forged documents were practically humming from inside the leather. "Mom, we need to talk about the bank again," David said, his voice dropping into that dark, authoritative register he reserved for subordinates. "I spent the weekend looking through the ledgers I could find in your study. Things are a mess. You haven't paid the property taxes on the commercial lots. You are writing checks to charities that don't even exist. You are a danger to yourself, Mom." I paid the taxes," I stammered, my eyes widening in feigned panic. "I know I did. Arthur and I always pay them in November." "Dad has been dead for 5 years, Mom," David snapped, the harshness of his tone echoing off the dining room walls. "Dad isn't here to fix this, I am. And you need to let me take over before you lose the house." It was time. I stood up from my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the heavy mahogany table. I reached for the large, heavy crystal pitcher filled with ice water to refill David's glass. I lifted it, but halfway across the table, I stopped. I let my eyes glaze over, completely unfocusing my gaze. I stared at the wall behind David, letting my mouth fall slightly open. I stood there, frozen like a statue, the heavy crystal pitcher trembling in my grip. "Mom?" David asked, his brow furrowing. "Mom, put the pitcher down." I slowly dragged my gaze away from the wall and looked down at my son. I stripped every ounce of maternal recognition from my eyes. I looked at him as if he were a complete, terrifying stranger who had just broken into my home. "Arthur," I whispered, my voice incredibly frail and laced with rising hysteria. I looked around the room frantically, my breathing quickening into sharp, ragged gasps. "Arthur, where are you? Why is this man sitting in David's chair?" "Barbara, it's David," Jessica said, her voice dripping with a sickening, manufactured calm. She didn't move to help me. She just sat there, watching the spectacle unfold. "Where is my son?" I shrieked, taking a stumbling step backward. "Who are you? Get out of my house, Arthur." I opened my hands. The heavy crystal water pitcher slipped through my fingers and plummeted toward the hardwood floor. The crash was deafening. Thick shards of expensive crystal exploded outward in a glittering wave, sending ice cubes and freezing water splashing across the polished wood and splattering against David's expensive leather shoes. I collapsed backward into my chair, bringing my hands up to the sides of my head, rocking back and forth, sobbing uncontrollably. "I don't know where I am. I don't know where my boy is. Please, somebody help me." I peeked through the gaps in my fingers, watching them through the veil of my fake, hysterical tears. Neither of them moved to comfort me. Neither of them rushed to my side to hold me or tell me that I was safe. Instead, David slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Over the shattered crystal and the pooling water, they exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was a look of absolute victory. The performance had worked flawlessly. To their greedy, predatory minds, my brain had just officially snapped in half. "It's over," David whispered to Jessica, a dark, vicious smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "She's completely gone." Jessica stepped delicately over the shattered glass, walking to my side. She patted my shoulder with a cold, detached rhythm. "Come on, Barbara, let's get you into bed. You've had a very long night." They ushered me up the stairs like a fragile, broken doll. They tucked me under the heavy duvet of my bed, turned off the lights, and closed the door. I lay perfectly still in the dark, listening to the muffled sounds of them hastily cleaning up the glass in the dining room below, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing as they left. The absolute second the house was silent, I sat up. I threw the duvet off my legs, my breathing perfectly calm, my heart rate steady and cool. The bait hadn't just been swallowed, it had been devoured. The next morning was Monday. I sat in my sunroom, drinking a cup of coffee and watching the morning news, waiting for the inevitable call. At exactly 10:15 a.m., the burner phone in the flour canister vibrated. I retrieved it and answered. "Richard." "He did it," the lawyer said, his voice practically purring with ruthless satisfaction. My contacts at the county courthouse just flagged it on the docket. David Arthur Sterling just filed an emergency, ex parte petition for temporary conservatorship over the person and estate of Barbara Ann Sterling. He submitted a sworn affidavit detailing a severe psychotic break that occurred last night and attached a durable power of attorney to bypass standard medical holds. The forged document, I confirmed, a dark, lethal smile spreading across my face. The forged document, Richard echoed. The judge has scheduled an emergency review hearing for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to grant the temporary orders. David thinks he's walking in there to collect the keys to your kingdom. Let him think it, I said, looking out over the sprawling, beautiful estate I had built with my own 2 hands. I will see you at the courthouse tomorrow, Richard. Tell the driver to pick me up at 8. The trap had officially snapped shut. My son had just committed a federal felony on the public record, entirely convinced he was the smartest man in the room. He had no idea that tomorrow morning, the frail, senile mother he thought he had buried was going to walk into that courtroom and unleash absolute hell. The morning of the emergency hearing dawned bright, cold, and razor-sharp. As I stood before the full-length mirror in my master dressing room, I took a moment to truly look at the woman reflecting back at me. For the past month, I had forced this woman to stoop her shoulders, tremble her hands, and wear the vacant, terrified expression of a mind slipping into the abyss. I had dressed her in oversized, frumpy cardigans and allowed my son to speak to her as if she were a remarkably slow toddler. But that woman was gone. The performance was officially over. I reached into my closet and pulled out a vintage, navy blue St. John knit suit. It was a suit that commanded authority, tailored to perfection, the kind of garment a CEO wears to fire a hostile board of directors. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse, my late husband's diamond-encrusted Rolex, and a pair of sensible but distinctly sharp Jimmy Choo pumps. I applied a bold coat of crimson lipstick, pulled my shoulders back, and lifted my chin. I didn't look like a frail, confused widow who needed a state-appointed guardian to manage her checkbook. I looked like a matriarch walking to a coronation. At exactly 8 o'clock, the sleek black town car pulled into the circular driveway. I locked the front door of the estate David was so desperately trying to steal, and slid into the warm leather backseat. "The county courthouse, Thomas," I instructed smoothly. "Right away, Mrs. Sterling," he replied, merging seamlessly into the morning traffic. When we arrived at the sprawling concrete and glass structure of the County Judicial Center, Richard Vance was already waiting for me at the bottom of the grand stone steps. He looked magnificent, a silver-haired shark swimming in his natural habitat. He held a thick, genuine leather legal folio under his arm, and as I stepped out of the town car, a wide, predatory smile broke across his face. "Barbara," Richard greeted, offering me his arm as we ascended the stairs. "You look absolutely lethal." "I feel lethal, Richard," I replied, the crisp autumn wind whipping at our coats. "Is the stage set?" "Perfectly," he assured me, guiding me through the heavy metal detectors and security checkpoints. David's attorney, a mid-level local guy named Gable, filed the emergency ex parte petition yesterday afternoon. Because they cited an immediate, severe danger to your physical safety and financial estate, Judge Abernathy granted a preliminary review hearing this morning. David thinks he is walking into a closed-door session to quietly collect his conservatorship without you ever knowing it happened. He has absolutely no idea we filed an immediate notice of appearance 10 minutes ago. "Then let's not keep my devoted son waiting," I said, a cold thrill racing down my spine. We took the elevator to the 4th floor and approached the heavy oak double doors of Department 14. Richard held a hand up, gesturing for us to pause just outside the glass viewing panel. Inside the courtroom, the scene was playing out exactly as I had envisioned. The room was mostly empty, save for the bailiff, the court reporter, and the judge sitting high upon the polished mahogany bench. David and Jessica were seated at the petitioner's table. David was currently standing at the podium, delivering his sworn testimony. Even through the heavy soundproofing of the doors, I could see the absolute mastery of his performance. He was leaning forward, his shoulders slumped, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken, dutiful son to absolute perfection. He was wiping a completely fabricated tear from his eye, looking up at the judge with an expression of manufactured agony. I pushed the door open just a crack, allowing his voice to bleed into the hallway. "It breaks my heart, Your Honor," David was saying, his voice cracking with theatrical grief. "I love my mother more than anything in this world, but she is completely gone. 2 nights ago, she had a severe psychotic break during Sunday dinner. She didn't know who I was. She screamed for my father, who has been dead for 5 years, and she became physically violent, smashing crystal across the dining room. Furthermore, she is hemorrhaging her life savings. She has drained tens of thousands of dollars from her accounts in a matter of days, writing checks to scammers. If you don't grant me temporary emergency control over her estate today, I fear there won't be anything left to protect, and worse, that she might seriously injure herself." Judge Abernathy, a stern woman with a reputation for taking elder abuse very seriously, looked down at David with a sympathetic sigh. She adjusted her reading glasses and reached for her gavel. "Mr. Sterling, I commend you for stepping up to care for your mother in this tragic situation," the judge said softly. "Given the sworn affidavit and the clear state of emergency, I am inclined to grant the temporary conservatorship pending a full medical." "Your Honor, if it please the court." The voice boomed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Richard Vance pushed the heavy oak doors entirely open. He strode down the center aisle with the terrifying, unshakable confidence of a man who owned the building. And right beside him, matching him step for step, was me. The sharp, rhythmic clack-clack-clack of my heels against the polished floor echoed like gunshots in the sudden, dead silence of the room. Jessica was the first to see me. She physically jolted in her chair, a sharp, audible gasp escaping her lips. Her hand flew to her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. David spun around at the podium. The color instantly, violently drained from his face. He looked as though he had just seen a ghost manifest in the middle of a Sunday mass. He stared at my immaculate designer suit, my perfectly coiffed hair, and the cold, deadly, entirely lucid glare I fixed directly upon him. "Excuse me," Judge Abernathy said sharply, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Counsel, who are you, and what is the meaning of this interruption?" "My apologies for the dramatic entrance, Your Honor," Richard said smoothly, stopping at the respondent's table and setting his leather folio down. "I am Richard Vance. I represent the respondent in this matter, Mrs. Barbara Ann Sterling, who is standing right here, in perfect health, and who vehemently objects to this fraudulent, bad faith petition in its absolute entirety." The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a pin drop. David's attorney, Mr. Gable, scrambled to his feet, looking completely blindsided. "Your Honor, we had no idea." The petitioner swore under oath that the respondent was entirely incapacitated and unable to comprehend these proceedings. "Does she look incapacitated to you, Mr. Gable?" Richard fired back, gesturing toward me. I stood tall, folding my hands in front of me, offering the judge a polite, respectful nod. "Your Honor," David stammered, his theatrical grief completely evaporating into sheer, suffocating panic. She is having a lucid moment. This happens with severe dementia. She dressed herself up today, but I swear to you, 2 nights ago she was a danger to herself. She is sick." "Let's address the sickness, shall we?" Richard Vance interrupted, his voice dripping with lethal precision. He unclasped his leather folio and pulled out the thick, certified medical packet I had secured just weeks prior. He marched directly up to the bench and handed the heavy envelope to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. "Your Honor, submitted into evidence as Exhibit A," Richard announced, turning slightly so his voice carried to the terrified couple sitting at the petitioner's table. "A comprehensive, certified neurological evaluation, including MRI scans, CT scans, and extensive cognitive stress tests, conducted just 3 weeks ago by Dr. Elias Kensington at the Hammond Clinic. I believe Your Honor is familiar with Dr. Kensington's esteemed reputation." Judge Abernathy blinked, opening the envelope. "Dr. Kensington is the foremost neurologist in the state. Proceed, Mr. Vance." "If you turn to page 4, Your Honor, you will find Dr. Kensington's certified conclusion," Richard said, a dark smile playing on his lips. "Mrs. Sterling does not have dementia. She does not have Alzheimer's. In fact, her cerebral cortex shows absolutely 0 signs of atrophy, and her cognitive function is currently operating in the 99th percentile. As Dr. Kensington noted, she possesses the mental acuity of a highly educated woman 30 years her junior. David gripped the edges of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His jaw worked silently, trying to find words that simply did not exist. The narrative of madness he and Jessica had so carefully manufactured, the foundation of their entire multi-million-dollar heist, was completely disintegrating before his very eyes. This is impossible, David choked out, looking frantically at his own lawyer. The money. She drained $50,000 from her checking account. She threw a pitcher across the dining room. She is crazy. My client is not crazy, Mr. Sterling, Richard Vance said, turning to look my son dead in the eye. My client is simply an exceptionally brilliant woman who realized her son was attempting to steal her $4 million estate and decided to give him exactly the performance he was asking for. A low, stunned murmur broke out from the court reporter. Judge Abernathy lowered the medical file, her eyes narrowing as she looked past the podium and fixed a glare of pure judicial fury directly upon David. But Richard Vance wasn't finished. The medical ambush had successfully destroyed David's narrative, but it was only the first half of our offensive. The shield had worked perfectly. Now, it was time for Richard to draw the sword and bring the blade down directly on David's neck. If the sheer weight of Judge Abernathy's glare could have generated physical force, my son would have been flattened against the courtroom floor. The air in Department 14 was thick, practically humming with the electric tension of a lie being violently dismantled in real time. David stood frozen at the petitioner's podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence to combat the flawless medical evaluation sitting on the judge's bench. But Richard Vance was a man who did not believe in merely wounding his opponents. He believed in absolute, scorched-earth eradication. Your Honor, Richard continued, his voice ringing out with terrifying, calm authority. The medical evidence I have just submitted merely proves that my client is of exceptionally sound mind. It proves that this petition is entirely baseless. However, it is the petitioner's own evidence that proves he is actively attempting to defraud this court and my client of $4 million. Judge Abernathy tore her furious gaze away from David and looked down at Richard. Explain yourself, counselor. Richard stepped back to the respondent's table, picked up a second, thinner manila folder, and walked it up to the bailiff. Your Honor, the petitioner has submitted a durable power of attorney to this court, claiming it was signed by my client, Barbara Sterling. We contend that the signature is a complete and total forgery. Objection, Mr. Gable, David's attorney, practically vaulted out of his chair, his face flushed with panic. Your Honor, these are outrageous, defamatory accusations. My client provided that document in good faith. Did he? Richard countered swiftly, turning to face Mr. Gable. Because submitted as Exhibit B are 3 high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of that exact document. My client took these photographs inside her own home, surreptitiously, after discovering the forged paperwork hidden inside her son's briefcase during one of his welfare checks. Note the timestamps, Your Honor. They precede this filing by 4 days. Judge Abernathy adjusted her glasses, examining the photographs the bailiff handed her. Furthermore, Richard pressed, his voice dropping into a lethal, surgical cadence. Attached to those photographs is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Arthur Peneligan, a board-certified forensic document examiner who frequently serves as an expert witness for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Dr. Peneligan reviewed the petitioner's submitted document against 40 years of my client's verified banking signatures. His conclusion is absolute. The signature on that power of attorney lacks the natural fluidity of Mrs. Sterling's handwriting. The pen pressure is entirely wrong, indicating a slow, deliberate tracing rather than a natural signature. It is, unequivocally, a forgery. The color drained so rapidly from Mr. Gable's face that I thought the man might faint. He looked at the paperwork, then turned to look at David, realizing in real time that his client had just made him an unwitting accomplice to a massive federal crime. Your Honor, Mr. Gable stammered, frantically packing his legal pads into his briefcase. I was completely unaware of these allegations. My client assured me the document was legitimate. In light of this evidence, I must formally request to withdraw as counsel for the petitioner, effective immediately. Granted, Judge Abernathy snapped, slamming her gavel down with a sharp, echoing crack. She leaned completely over the mahogany bench, pointing a trembling finger directly at my son. "Mr. Sterling," she seethed, her voice radiating pure, unadulterated judicial fury. "This court does not take kindly to perjury. And it certainly does not tolerate the weaponization of the judicial system to facilitate elder abuse and financial fraud. Your emergency petition for temporary conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice." "Your Honor, please, she's lying," David begged, his voice cracking in genuine, pathetic desperation. "The money. She drained the accounts. Look at the bank statements." "Silence," the judge roared. She turned to the bailiff. "Officer, confiscate the original power of attorney submitted by the petitioner. You are to bag it into evidence and walk it directly down to the district attorney's fraud division with a transcript of today's hearing. Let the DA decide how quickly they want to impanel a grand jury." She looked back at David, her eyes narrowed to dark, unforgiving slits. "You are incredibly lucky I am not having you remanded into custody this very second, Mr. Sterling. You are dismissed. Get out of my courtroom." The heavy strike of her gavel signaled the end of the massacre. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply picked up my designer handbag, offered Judge Abernathy a polite, deeply respectful nod, and turned to walk down the center aisle. Richard Vance fell into step beside me, his stride confident and victorious. We pushed through the heavy oak doors, stepping out into the expansive, marble-floored hallway of the courthouse. The air felt remarkably clean, as if a toxic smog had finally lifted from my lungs. But the silence didn't last long. 10 seconds later, the courtroom doors burst open. David stormed out, his face mottled with purple, raging fury. Jessica trailed a few steps behind him, looking like a deer caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming 18-wheeler. "You set me up," David screamed, his voice echoing violently down the courthouse corridor. He abandoned the charade entirely, charging toward me with his fists clenched. "You faked the whole damn thing. You pretended to be senile just to humiliate me in front of a judge." Richard Vance stepped smoothly in front of me, placing a hand squarely on David's chest to halt his advance. "I highly suggest you lower your voice and step back, David. You are currently standing in a courthouse, seconds away from a felony fraud indictment. Assaulting the victim won't help your bail conditions." "I am owed that estate," David snarled, spittle flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger at me. "I am your only son. My business is going under. We have balloon payments due in 60 days, and you are playing games with my inheritance. Where is the money, Mom? Where did you hide the $50,000 from the checking account?" I stepped around Richard, closing the distance between my son and me. I looked at the panicked, greedy, pathetic man standing in front of me and felt absolutely nothing. No grief, no maternal instinct, just the cold, clinical satisfaction of a flawless execution. "You really think this is about $50,000, David?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the sharp, cutting edge of a razor. "You gave me the script, darling. I merely read the lines. You wanted me to be confused, so I was confused. But while you were busy moving my reading glasses into the refrigerator to make me feel crazy, I was busy moving my empire." I reached into my handbag and pulled out a simple, elegant black folder. I held it out to him. David snatched it from my hand, his eyes frantically darting over the pages inside. Jessica crept up behind his shoulder, reading over his arm. "What is this?" David demanded, his breathing shallow. "That is a copy of my new irrevocable trust," I explained, watching the dawning horror begin to twist his features. "The lake house in Geneva, sold. The commercial strip mall on the west side, sold. I quietly liquidated $3.5 million of my assets over the last month. And then, I placed every single penny of it into that trust." David stared at the legal jargon, his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. You can't do this. An irrevocable trust means." "It means I no longer legally own the assets," I finished for him, offering a dark, victorious smile. "Which means that even if you somehow managed to find a corrupt doctor to declare me incompetent tomorrow, you could never touch a dime of that money. It is locked in an impenetrable legal vault." "We're ruined," Jessica whimpered, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She backed away from David, looking at him not as her wealthy, successful husband, but as an anchor tied to her neck, dragging her down into criminal and financial oblivion. "Who gets it?" David choked out, tears of sheer, unadulterated despair pooling in his eyes. When you die, who gets the money? 80% of the estate goes to Chloe, I said smoothly, invoking the name of the daughter he had abandoned. With strict legal stipulations barring you from ever acting as a trustee or proxy. If you so much as ask her for a loan, the trust will fund her legal fees to bury you, and the remaining 20%. I smiled, thinking of the brilliant irony. The remaining 20% goes to the Golden Years Animal Rescue. I figured a shelter full of stray dogs deserved my money far more than a snake. David's knees literally buckled. He sagged against the marble wall of the courthouse hallway, the black folder slipping from his numb fingers and scattering across the floor. You wanted to bury me, David, I whispered, looking down at the man who had tried to erase my existence. But you forgot one crucial detail. I own the shovel. I turned my back on them both, the sharp clack-clack of my heels echoing in the grand hallway as Richard and I walked toward the elevators. I didn't look back. The financial phantom was complete, the revenge was absolute, and my golden years were finally, truly my own. There is a profound, almost terrifying efficiency to the legal system when a judge has been personally insulted. For years, I had watched the wheels of justice turn at a sluggish, bureaucratic crawl, but Judge Abernathy's fury acted as a powerful accelerant. True to her word, the bailiff did not merely file the forged durable power of attorney in a standard evidence locker. He hand-delivered it to the district attorney's fraud division alongside the official court transcript of my son's perjury. The fallout was not a slow leak. It was a catastrophic dam failure. Within 48 hours of our courtroom showdown, Richard Vance called me with the update I had been waiting for. 2 detectives from the county's financial crimes unit had paid an unannounced visit to David's corporate office. They didn't come to ask polite questions over coffee. They came armed with a warrant, seizing his computer hard drives, his personal ledgers, and the Italian leather briefcase that contained the original drafts of his forged documents. They formally indicted him this morning, Barbara, Richard told me, his voice carrying the crisp, satisfied tone of a master tactician watching his strategy play out perfectly. Felony forgery, attempted grand theft, and perjury. Because he submitted the document to a judge in a sworn legal proceeding to bypass a medical hold, the DA is absolutely salivating over the case. They are going to make an example out of him. And the bail? I asked, looking out my kitchen window at my perfectly manicured rose bushes. Set at $250,000, Richard replied. Which, ironically, he might have a very difficult time posting, considering his business is currently imploding. Richard was right. The criminal indictment was merely the spark. The real explosion occurred within David's fragile financial house of cards. As I had learned from the security camera audio that fateful afternoon, David was drowning in toxic commercial debt. He had balloon payments due in less than 60 days, payments he had entirely planned to cover using the millions he intended to steal from my liquidated estate. But in the business world, reputation is currency, and news of a felony fraud indictment travels faster than a wildfire. The moment the local business journals published a tiny, buried blurb about his arrest for attempting to defraud his own elderly mother, his creditors panicked. Banks despise risk, and an indicted CEO facing 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary is the ultimate liability. His commercial lenders immediately called in his loans, citing the moral turpitude clauses hidden deep within his contracts. Without my $4 million to act as his safety net, David had absolutely zero capital to satisfy the debts. His accounts were frozen. His corporate assets were seized by the bank. Within 2 weeks of his arrest, the doors to his prestigious downtown office were padlocked, and a neon-orange foreclosure notice was slapped across the glass. The empire he had sacrificed his own mother to save was reduced to absolute dust. But the most poetic, vicious twist of the knife didn't come from the district attorney, the banks, or even from me. It came from the woman he had conspired with. Jessica was a creature built entirely on the foundation of convenience and luxury. She had married David for the country club memberships, the European vacations, and the undeniable prestige of the sterling family name. She had gleefully participated in moving my reading glasses, hiding my keys, and whispering poison into my ear to convince me I was going insane, all because she wanted a larger slice of my pie. But Jessica was also a survivor in the most parasitic sense of the word. The absolute second she realized that the $4 million was locked permanently inside an irrevocable trust, and that her husband was facing bankruptcy and a lengthy prison sentence, her loyalty evaporated into thin air. Rather than standing by his side to fight the criminal charges, Jessica hired a cutthroat divorce attorney. To protect herself from being charged as an accessory to the forgery, she actively threw David under the bus. She filed a sworn statement with the DA's office, claiming she had no idea the power of attorney was forged, and that David was a controlling, manipulative husband who had orchestrated the entire gaslighting campaign completely on his own. She emptied their joint checking accounts, packed her designer clothes, and abandoned him in their sprawling, empty, heavily mortgaged house. David was left completely, utterly isolated. He had no money, no wife, no business, and no family. A month after the courtroom ambush, on a rainy Tuesday evening, the intercom buzzer at my front security gate chimed. I was sitting in my study, finalizing the paperwork for the sale of my estate. I glanced at the security monitor on my desk. Standing in the freezing rain, soaked to the bone, was my son. His luxury SUV was nowhere in sight. He must have taken a taxi, or worse, walked from the bus stop. He looked incredibly thin, his shoulders hunched against the cold, staring desperately up at the camera lens. I reached out and pressed the intercom button. I didn't say a word. I simply opened the channel, letting the static hum of the rain fill my study. "Mom," David's voice cracked through the speaker. It wasn't the smooth, patronizing tone he had used to tell me my mind was failing, nor was it the raging, entitled scream he had unleashed in the courthouse hallway. It was the pathetic, broken whimper of a beaten animal. "Mom, please talk to me," he begged, gripping the iron bars of the security gate. "I have nothing. Jessica left me. The bank took the company. My lawyers are telling me I might serve actual time. I'm terrified, Mom, please." I sat in my leather chair, watching the monitor. A small, buried part of my soul, the mother who had once bandaged his scraped knees and celebrated his little league victories, ached with a phantom, residual sadness. But I quickly reminded myself of the nursing home pamphlets hidden in his briefcase. I reminded myself of the absolute, chilling lack of empathy in his eyes when I had shattered the crystal pitcher on the floor. "I cannot help you, David," I said, my voice echoing out of the speaker at the gate, smooth, calm, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You can," he wept, pressing his forehead against the wet iron. "Call the DA, tell them you forgive me, tell them it was a misunderstanding. If the victim withdraws support, they might drop the felony charges to a misdemeanor. You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me." "I spent my entire life protecting you," I replied evenly. "I gave you every advantage, every luxury, and every ounce of my love, and in return you tried to erase my existence. You didn't just want my money, David. You wanted my dignity. You wanted to lock me in a sterile room to rot, completely alone, so you could pay off your debts." "I was desperate," he sobbed. "I was losing everything." "And now you have," I stated, the finality of the words hanging heavy in the damp air. "I cannot withdraw the charges, David. The state of Florida is prosecuting you because you committed perjury and forgery in a court of law. You brought this upon yourself. You dug this grave with your own 2 hands, and now you are going to have to lie in it. Mom, please don't do this. I'm your son." "The boy I raised died a long time ago," I whispered, feeling the last, lingering thread of our connection completely sever. "Do not come to this house again, David. The police will be called." I released the intercom button, cutting off his frantic, desperate apologies. I watched the security monitor for another 10 minutes as David collapsed onto the wet pavement outside the gate, weeping into his hands, completely broken by the weight of his own greed. Eventually, he stood up, pulled his thin jacket tight around his shoulders, and walked slowly away into the rain, disappearing into the dark. I turned off the monitor, closed my laptop, and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of wine. The criminal fallout was absolute. The surgical removal of the tumor in my life was completely finished. All that remained was for me to pack my bags, close the door on the ghosts of this massive, empty estate, and finally step out into the brilliant sunshine of my newly reclaimed freedom. 3 months after my son walked away from my front gate in the freezing rain, the massive colonial estate that had served as the battleground for my sanity was officially sold. The buyer was a young, energetic family who immediately began drawing up plans to remodel the kitchen and paint over the dark, heavy mahogany. I didn't mind in the slightest. As I stood in the empty foyer on the day of the final walkthrough, looking at the bare brass hook where David and Jessica had once hidden my car keys to make me feel insane, I felt absolutely no nostalgia. I felt only a profound, breathtaking sense of liberation. I didn't need a 6-bedroom monument to the past. I needed a future. I left the cold autumn winds of the north behind and moved to the sun-drenched Gulf Coast of Florida. I didn't buy a house. I purchased a stunning, ultramodern penthouse condo right on the water. It has floor-to-ceiling windows that let the brilliant morning light spill across the wide plank oak floors and a massive wraparound balcony where the salty ocean breeze blows through year-round. It is a home built for peace, not for hiding. Through Richard Vance, who still manages the ironclad Irrevocable Trust, I learned the final details of my son's fate. David accepted a plea deal to avoid a protracted public trial, ultimately receiving a 3-year sentence in a state facility for felony forgery and fraud. His bankruptcy was absolute. Jessica had successfully divorced him, dropping the sterling name as quickly as she had taken it, and moved out of state to try and find her next meal ticket. The parasitic chapter of my life was officially, permanently closed. Instead of mourning the son I had lost to greed, I invested all of my love into the family who had always loved me for exactly who I was. My granddaughter, Chloe, visits me frequently. During her spring break, she flew down to Florida. We spent the afternoons walking along the beach, collecting seashells, and the evenings sitting on my balcony, sipping crisp white wine and watching the sun melt into the ocean. When she casually mentioned the crushing weight of her student loans for nursing school, I simply smiled, reached into my purse, and handed her a certified bank draft that paid off her entire tuition in full. The look of pure, stunned gratitude on her face, the tears of genuine joy she shed as she hugged me, was worth every single penny. Chloe is going to inherit a vast empire one day, but more importantly, she is going to inherit the knowledge of how to protect it. I spend my days exactly as I please. I travel, I read, I paint, and I enjoy the absolute serenity of a life lived entirely on my own terms. My golden years are not going to be spent rotting in a state-run facility staring at a blank wall, waiting for a son to spend the money I earned. They are going to be spent in the sunshine. I survived the ultimate betrayal not by shrinking, but by sharpening my mind and reminding myself of exactly who I was. They thought they were playing a game with a confused old woman. They had no idea they had sat down at the table with the architect. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one absolute, echoing truth to take away from Barbara Sterling's story, it is this: never mistake a mother's silence for ignorance, and never mistake kindness for weakness. If you try to bury the woman who gave you life, don't be surprised when she buys the cemetery. Society often conditions us to believe that as people age, they naturally lose their agency, their fire, and their right to autonomy. Far too often, toxic family members view their elderly relatives not as human beings who deserve respect, but as living bank accounts waiting to be drained. They manipulate, they gaslight, and they weaponize a parent's unconditional love against them. Barbara's story is a chilling reminder of how quickly greed can rot a family from the inside out, but it is also a masterclass in profound self-respect and boundaries. When Barbara discovered her son's ultimate betrayal, she didn't react with blind, hysterical anger. She reacted with cold, calculated intelligence. She recognized her own immense worth, audited her life, and fiercely protected her peace and her assets. Being generous does not mean you must become a martyr. Being older does not mean you are invisible, compliant, or incapable of fighting back. If you ever find yourself being treated as a mere convenience, or if someone attempts to manipulate your reality for their own gain, remember Barbara's quiet, lethal strength. You have the absolute right to cut off the accounts, financial and emotional, that drain your soul, protect your legacy, set your boundaries with ironclad resolve, and proudly invest your love only into the relationships that genuinely, joyfully give it back. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Have you ever had to set a massive boundary with a toxic family member to protect your own peace or livelihood? How did you find the strength to walk away? Let me know your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. If you found Barbara's journey as thrilling and empowering as I did, Please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Until next time, know your worth, protect your peace, and take care of yourselves.